As you can see, I have been working a lot with the Waterborne surf and rail adapters lately, and in the process, I've both gained a real appreciation for both of them, as well as learned a lot of little details and nuances for working with them. So in this video, I'll share what I've learned to make it easier for you to build your own custom setups with the Waterborne surf and rail adapters. Where the Waterborne really shines for me is building a lot of creative custom setups as cheaply as possible. You can use almost any typical longboard and use all of the component parts and just slap a Waterborne surf and rail adapter on it, and you have an instant surf skate. So what you're seeing here is just a bunch of stuff that I've gotten off of eBay and thrown Waterborne surf adapters on them. So my first tip is, if you're the kind of person who loves tinkering and experimenting with custom setups, then I highly recommend that you add the Waterborne surf adapter to your quiver if you haven't done so already. Okay, so I have a 60-inch coastal drifter here, and what I'm going to do is install a surf adapter and rail adapter on this, and while I do it, I'm going to be giving you tips throughout. And I have here an old version of the surf and rail adapters, the new Finn version, and then the brand new Dream version here. So let me first talk about the differences between these, because that's going to be your first decision of which one you get. So first, let's talk about the differences between the old one and the new Finn version. So they made some changes to this Finn, and the most notable one is this piece right here, what it's named after. This is what they call the Finn piece. And if you've seen my Finn review, you know that this allows you to change the mode. You can go from Mega Pump mode, Standard mode, or Mega Carve mode. But I'll tell you that the main reason why I prefer the Finn over the old version isn't really the Finn. It's actually that they've made it much easier to install. So this is the old version here, and what you used to have to do on the old version is your bolts would go through the deck and then come through right here, and they would protrude through here, and then you would have to put a nut on the other side. But what they've done on the Finn is they've given you these holes that you can just drill your bolts straight into, and you don't need any nuts on this other side. So that right there is the main difference why I prefer the Finn, because it's just much easier to install than the original. And it's also the exact same thing on the rail adapters here. So this is the old one, and again, you used to have to put your bolts through here and then have nuts coming in through here. And on the Finn, you can just screw your bolts through here. You don't need any nuts on this other side. Now let's talk about the difference between the new Dream system and these others. And what they've done with the Dream is that they've given us a complete integrated adapter here. So instead of attaching regular TKP or RKP trucks to it, you've got a complete system here just like any other surf skate truck. So aside from the design, the main difference between the Dream and these other ones is that the Dream only comes currently with reverse kingpin trucks. Whereas with these other ones, you can use either traditional kingpin trucks or reverse kingpin trucks, so you have a little bit more customization options with these. But like the Finn system here, the Dream also is very easy to install because they've given you these holes that you can screw your bolts into. So when you're choosing between these three, here's my recommendations. First of all, if you're choosing between these two, go with the Finn over the old one because it's much easier to install and you have the options with the Finn. If you're choosing between the new Finn and the new Dream, then the main decision there is going to be, do you want to use traditional kingpin trucks or reverse kingpin trucks? So if you know that you want to use reverse kingpin trucks, then for sure I'm going to say go with that Dream. However, if you want the ability to use either traditional kingpin trucks or reverse kingpin trucks, then I'm going to say to go with the Finn system on that standard adapter. Now if we're just talking about the rail adapter, to be honest, there's three reasons why I haven't used it much in the past, and Pat at Waterborne knows it's all love. But those reasons are, number one, it's kind of hard to work with. Number two, the stock bushings are very soft. They're too soft for me, so they really create wheel bite for me at my weight. And the third reason is that the old version used to rattle. But we have solutions for all three of those things now. Now we've always had a solution for the bushings, that's just to make the bushings harder, but they've also upgraded the rail adapter to eliminate the other two issues. So as far as it being hard to work with, like I said, they've fixed this by making it much easier to install with these pre-drilled holes for your bolts that eliminate any kind of nuts on this other side here. As far as the rattle goes, here's an old version, and what creates the rattle is this plate rubbing against your kingpins here. And to fix that, what they've done is they've given us these little pieces right here, and they've widened the holes here, so this will just fit over the top of that right there, and now we don't have any contact of that plate against the kingpin. So this was a really smart upgrade, and this is another reason why I say go with the new Finn version as opposed to the old version. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit on this coastal build because typically there would be an experimentation process where I would try a few different things before I finally honed in on what my final setup was going to be. But in this case, I've already done all that experimentation, so I'm going to just put this together in a way that I like best. So in this case, I'm going to use the Finn system with the standard adapter because I want to use traditional kingpin trucks on this not reverse kingpin trucks. So speaking of traditional kingpin trucks versus reverse kingpin trucks, that's going to be your next decision. So when you look at these up close, you have a traditional kingpin truck here where you have the pivot point here and you have the adjustment nut on the other side of your pivot point. On a reverse kingpin truck, you have your pivot point and your adjustment nut on the same side of the hanger. You'll also notice that reverse kingpin trucks sit up higher off the ground than traditional kingpin trucks. So traditional kingpin trucks make for more nimble carving, and reverse kingpin trucks feel flowier and not quite as nimble. So after a lot of experimentation, for most setups, I've come to prefer the traditional kingpin trucks over the reverse kingpin trucks, although there's some setups where I'll actually prefer the reverse kingpin trucks. So for example, a really big and inflexible board like this one, this is 60 inches long and 14.5 inches wide. So you'll see that I'm using reverse kingpin trucks on this one because I prefer that for this one. But for most of my setups, I'm going to prefer TKPs over RKPs. Although that leads us to another challenge, which is wheel bite, and I'll give you some pointers of how to avoid that. But first I want to make one more point about the trucks that you use, and that is that the width of your truck hanger makes a difference as well. So it may be hard for you to see the differences visually here, but I have 3 TKP trucks that are all different hanger widths. So this one is 150 millimeters wide, this one is 159 millimeters wide, and then this is 169 millimeters wide. So that's the hanger width, but if we're measuring the axle width, that means that this one measures 8.5 inches wide, this one is 8.75 inches wide, and this one is 9.125 inches wide. And I've tried several different widths, and me personally, I much prefer the narrower widths. So if I'm going to use TKP trucks, I don't like to use hangers that are wider than 150 millimeters. These wider ones will work, but they're just not quite as nimble and don't feel quite as good as the narrower ones. And another issue is that the wider your truck hanger, the more prone you are to wheel bite. So narrower hangers is also going to help you with the wheel bite issue. And it's the same with reverse kingpin trucks. I've got a variety here that are different widths as well as different heights. So those details matter. And again, for me, the general principle is you want to go narrower hangers over wider, unless again, it's on some really big setup where some of these wider RKPs might work well. Now, like I said, if you choose to use traditional kingpin trucks, well, that's going to present a possible issue of wheel bite. So we have a few different solutions to eliminate wheel bite. One is we can just add risers, although I do not like the feel of that at all because the surf adapters already put you so much higher off the ground. So personally, I don't ever use risers to eliminate wheel bite, but again, that's just personal preference. You might like it. The next option is you can use reverse kingpin trucks instead of traditional kingpin trucks, which sit higher off the ground and completely eliminate wheel bite. So you won't have any wheel bite issues at all with reverse kingpin trucks on the waterborne. Another solution is you can use smaller wheels instead of bigger wheels. Another solution is you can use a Dremel to make wheel wells. Obviously, this is not going to be something that you do on nice decks that you want to look nice. The only reason I did this on this deck is because I actually have 2 coastal drifters and I kept one nice and I got another one so I could just experiment and play with it. So this is me just kind of playing around with it to try to figure it out. But this is an option for you, and to be honest, this to me is kind of like one of the easiest, quickest solutions to get rid of it, because this allows me to stay with my traditional kingpin trucks and have larger wheels if I want to. And then if we're talking about eliminating wheel bite on the rail adapter, you have all the options I just listed, as well as you can change these bushings to make them harder, which will give you a little bit less lean. Okay, so we have our waterborne fin system here with rail adapter, we have TKPs, we have wheels, we have all the hardware we need to put this together. So when you read the instructions on the box of the waterborne, they give you instructions for putting it together by keeping all of this stuff apart. And so they basically tell you to attach your truck to this and then attach this whole thing to your deck. And if you're using an old adapter and putting nuts in between here, that means that you're having to work with nuts in between here. So that can be a real pain to work with. So what I've learned is when I'm putting together a waterborne setup, for me, it's a lot easier to just take these both apart and put them together apart, and you'll see what I mean here. And the other reason I do that is because I change out the bushings in both the surf adapter and the rail adapter, so I have to take it apart anyway to do that. So our first step here is I'm going to take apart this surf adapter. So I'm going to take a skate tool here and we're going to just take this nut off. Now we're going to pull these 2 plates apart. And on the top here, you're going to see we have a set of washers and bearings here. And I just keep those all stacked up, and we're going to just set them to the side here. And then inside here, we have another set of washers and bearings and our bushing. To remove these washers and bearings, I use just a little tiny screwdriver like this to just kind of fish them out like this. And again, I'm going to just keep these all together like that and just set them aside. And now we get to the surf adapter bushing, and here's where I have another tip for you. The stock waterborne bushing is 95A durometer, which for my weight makes it very quite divey, and it doesn't have as much rebound back to center as I would like. So if you're over 150 pounds, I highly recommend that you replace the stock waterborne bushing and go from the 95A to the harder Riptide in 97.5A. That gives the waterborne a lot more rebound, and for me at my weight, it makes it feel a lot better. There's a couple of ways that we can replace this. So first, to replace it, we have to remove this bushing. Now, one method that I've used is channel locks, and you can use channel locks to kind of hold on to that and twist it out. But what I've learned is that some are easier than others. You can do that on some, but others it's almost impossible to use the channel locks on, in which case you're going to have to use a hammer to hammer out this kingpin. I'm not going to demonstrate this for you because it's really easy to do and you can do it, but you just want to make sure that you put this nut on top of that kingpin first and then hammer down on this to avoid any damage to the kingpin. Because if you hammer directly on that kingpin, you're probably going to ruin the threads here and then you won't be able to get that nut back on. Put this nut on about so to where it's just almost flush with the top of that bolt. And then you're going to take a hammer and you're going to just pound it out like so. And it can be kind of hard and you can really whack it. You're not going to ruin anything. And then that's going to push that kingpin nut down, at which point you'll remove this nut. You'll pull the kingpin completely out. Then you'll put the new bushing in, put the kingpin back in, and then we're ready to put this back together once we've replaced that bushing. So our next step is to attach this piece to our deck. So this is just going to sit on here like this, and then we'll put on the other piece on top of it. Now we get to a really important point here, which is you have to have the right length screws, because if you have too long of screws, they're going to protrude past here, and when this plate is swinging, it can knock on that. Now in this case, I've already done the work, so I know that 1-inch screws is going to be the best. So that's how much that bolt sticks out. And again, we're using the fin system, which means I can just screw directly into that plate. Now if we're using the standard adapter, that bolt is not going to be long enough because it'll have to stick through here and protrude enough to be able to fit a nut over it. Now related to this, here's a tiny little nuance that can actually make a difference here. If you look at these nuts, you'll notice that some 1032 nuts are taller than others. So these are actually from a Carver CX, and Carver nuts are actually lower than what you get from waterborne. Now here's why this matters. If you're using a bolt that sticks through here and you're trying to attach a nut to this side, well, if you use these shorter nuts, that means you can use slightly shorter screws in here. And again, this is a tiny little nuance, but I've had a lot of cases where this actually makes a difference, because this nut right here means the difference between that screw protruding too much. But again, since we're working with the fin system that allows us to screw right into these, that's not going to be so much of an issue. We're going to use 1-inch screws on this, so let's put this together. I'm going to just take my drill here and my plate here. All right, so now we got our top piece installed to our deck, and you'll see how those bolts are flush here, so we don't have to worry about that plate knocking against those. Now we have this piece to attach here, but before we do that, we're going to attach our TKP truck to this piece. So to do that, you're going to use these bolts that they provide you with your waterborne kit. And we're going to put these, slot these through like this on top. Now you're going to just use your fingers to keep those in those channels, because this is what allows you to tighten those like so. So we've got to keep those in those channels like that. We're going to use our fingers to just hold them in place. Turn this over. Now you got to make sure that your pivot point is facing forward. So we're going to be installing it like that. So that'll just sit over the top of there. We'll take our nuts. Now that we've got our nuts sitting loosely on there, we'll just, again, hold those bolts from this other side here while we use a skate tool to tighten those up. All right, so now we have our TKP installed to our plate, and now we're going to put this on here. Before we do that, I forgot one quick piece when we were talking about replacing the bushing, and that is that if you don't grease up this bushing, it can squeak a little bit. So you'll see that there's actually a little bit of grease on your adapter. So I'll actually just kind of swipe it with my finger, and then I'll just rub it a little bit, get a thin layer all over that bushing, and that will prevent it from squeaking. So now we're going to take this set of internal washers and bearings here, and that's just going to slide over the top there. Then we take this piece right here, and it just sits over that bushing and slides over the top. Then we take our second set of bearings and washers, put it in there, and then this big washer goes over the top, and then we use our nut on top. And now that we've got this TKP truck attached, I can tighten this down with a skate tool, but it's going to be knocking against that every time you do that. So once I get it to this point, now I'm going to use a ratchet wrench to tighten this down. And we want to make sure that this is snug without being too tight, because if you push it down too tight, you can damage those bearings. This is pretty perfect on that, and we don't have any squeaking because we greased that bushing. So now we've installed our surf adapter. Let's move on to our rail adapter. So here we have our rail adapter, and again, instead of trying to install it all together like this, I'm going to take this all apart because I always replace the bushings anyway. Now you'll notice that I have yellow Riptide 90A bushings in here, but we're going to just pretend that these are the stock 85A bushings because I'm going to replace them with some 87.5As. So you're going to just take, again, your skate tool. We'll remove these kingpin nuts off of both of these. And these top bushings will come off, and then this plate comes off. We have these little pieces here if you're using the updated version. Now the stock rail adapter comes with barrel bushings on the bottom and cone bushings on the top. And another point I wanted to make about this is you want to make sure you get the right sizes. These are 0.6 inches tall. They're typical longboard bushing sizes, but you don't have to use barrels and cones. You can use cones on these. So I'm going to replace our bushings with Riptide bushings in 87.5A, which is just a little bit harder than their stock 85A. And we're using cones on these instead of barrels on the bottom. So if we're using cones on the bottom instead of barrels, they're going to sit on here like so. So now, instead of putting this all together, now we're going to attach this plate to our deck, same way we did the adapter. But before we do that, you need to know that there's some different configurations that you can do with this rail adapter. The way that they have you install it is this way. With this piece like this, they have the instructions say to put this piece towards the back of your deck like so. And then on this piece, it would be just the opposite. So we would switch this around to where this piece is opposite like so. Now, if you do it like they say, this will actually narrow your wheelbase. So if you're working with a deck that already has kind of a relatively narrow wheelbase, this might affect it too much and narrow your wheelbase too much. But you can fix that because there's multiple variations that you can use with this. So for starters, you could turn this around like so. But also, if you put these plates where they're facing the same way, again, they tell you to install it this way, but if we turn it around this way, this will actually allow us to widen our wheelbase because it'll push that TKP back. The danger if you do that is you'll see now that these holes will line up. So if you have bolts going through each of these holes, one going this way sticking out here, another one going here sticking out here, and then you have nuts on top of each of those. Well, when this rail adapter is moving back and forth, if those bolts are protruding too much, those nuts and bolts can kind of knock against each other. Play with that to get the right wheelbase option for you. Just be aware that if you have the plates facing the same way, you got to make sure that your bolts are short enough to not protrude too much so they don't knock against each other. In our case here, we're working with a very long deck, so we don't really care about wheelbase, so we're going to just install it like they say to. So we're going to put this plate on like so. Now we grab our rail adapter, and again, since we're using the fin system, we're going to be able to screw right into those without using nuts. Now we have our plate installed to our deck. Now we want to attach this plate to here, but again, we're going to attach our TKP to this before we put it on. And in our case here, since we're installing the plate this way, that means that our TKP has to go on the truck this way so that our pivot cup is facing out. So that's just going to sit on there like this, and now we'll screw in these bolts. So now we have this put together. So now this is just going to slide over the top of these kingpins. Then we'll take these two pieces here, put them over there. Those will slide into there like so. And now we take our top cone bushings, followed by our washers and our nuts. And again, we could use a skate tool here, but much easier to use a ratchet wrench. Now we have our rail adapter installed, so final piece is just to put on our wheels. So that's it. Here's our complete waterborne setup. I hope you found these tips helpful as you're putting together your waterborne setups. So now let's take this thing for a ride, see how she rides.